Okay, so I'm gonna have to calibrate my pen, I guess. Whatever. So this is ZBrush. ZBrush is very weird. I'll explain that right away. It's a very bizarre software when it comes to 3D. So if you take a look, when you open the software by default, there's this thing called Lightbox that opens up. So Lightbox is basically kind of a quick way to access projects or tools. In this case, I guess the way to think about it, I'm going to go to Tool, I'm going to load, so the Tool category, and then I'm going to go to Polysphere. So oops. Oh, this is so weird. Double tap on Polysphere, and then you can drag it out. Now to hide Lightbox or to reveal it, you can hit the comma key on your keyboard. And you're going to notice if you just drag out, so let me go back. I'll hit Control N to make a new canvas. Okay, so I went to, by default it starts in Project. I just went over to the next category, which is Tool. And then I selected Polysphere.z tool. Oops. Okay, so if I click and drag this out, it's going to drag out that sphere. Now, you may think as soon as you do that, you can basically start modeling, but what happens is you're basically dropping copies of this as a yeah, you're basically dropping like sort of 2.5D snapshots of this object onto the canvas. So, like I said, ZBrush is weird. What it does is it treats 3D mesh by default as a kind of brush stroke, like a Photoshop brush stroke. So the weird thing is, when you want to edit a 3D model, you actually are almost like creating a custom brush or a custom tool. So if you notice on the right side, there's a tool palette, right? So that tool palette and everything below it is where you're going to spend most of your time as a 3D modeler inside of ZBrush. So in order to edit one of these objects, the last one that you've dropped on the canvas, so if you notice in the upper left corner there's this thing called Edit. Shortcut for that, by the way, is T. Okay, so if you hit T or just tap on the Edit button, you can now, might be hard to see, but there. Just putting the wireframe on. Wireframe, by the way, is Shift F. So you can see the wireframe. So now if you kind of move off the model with your pen, tablet pen, just kind of drop it down and move it, you'll see that you're rotating that last sphere. If you hit F, it fills the frame with that sphere. Okay. So if you want to get rid of the stuff that's in the background, this kind of stuff that's been left on the canvas, just simply hit Control N, which will wipe the canvas clean, but keep your edited tool active. All right. So yeah, when you want to zoom, you have to hold Alt off the model, hold Alt, pen down, which kind of moves it left to right, up and down. As soon as you let go of Alt, but keep the pen on the canvas or on your tablet, you can now zoom in and out. And if you want to frame it, like in Maya, you hit F and it kind of fills the frame with that object. Okay, so again, just a reminder. So if you're just using a mouse, it's left click and drag off of the model. So once you're in edit mode, very important, you have to be in edit mode, right? That's T on your keyboard, and it turns that gray edit button in the upper left corner, it turns it orange, right? So now if you're using a pen, you just pen down and draw on the screen off of the model to rotate it, or it's left mouse click and drag to rotate it around. Okay. To pan it left to right, up and down, which means to basically keep it at the same distance but move it left, right, up, down, it's Alt, and then your tablet pen down and drag, or left mouse click and drag, right, with Alt active. That's just to move it left, right, up, and down, right? As soon as you let go of Alt, that enters into a zoom mode, which allows you to zoom in and out. Again, it's a little goofy, right? But it's actually designed for, many tablets have, right, they've got a couple of buttons on the left side, right side, and a lot of those buttons are mapped to Alt, Shift, Control. So most of the features of any brush that you are using in ZBrush are designed to use some combination of those 3 buttons, so you don't necessarily have to go into all the menus and settings of every brush. Okay? So that's just basic navigation. So what we basically have right now, I'm going to hit Shift F, which is called polyframe, which is essentially wireframe, really. That's what it should be called. If you look on the right-hand side of ZBrush, you'll see Draw Polyframe. So you can either activate that button to see the sort of mesh density, or you can hit Shift F to turn that off and on. I generally prefer the shortcuts. So on the right side, we've got, I'll keep this simple early on. We've got geometry, okay? So under geometry, you've basically got subdivisions. If I raise and lower them, it's just like in 3D Max or Maya. If you subdivide the mesh, right, 1 polygon gets split up into 4. If you subdivide it again, or if you have more subdivisions, 4 polygons becomes 4 times that, right? So 4 will become 16. If you want to see the poly count, for me, I've customized the interface, so I've got active points on the left side. So if I go down to my low res, it's a 1500 poly sphere, basically, or 1500 vertex sphere. For you guys, it's probably over on the right side, I think, which is the default. Yes? Yes. So active points. So if you go, by the way, if you want to see, if you've got a model with subdivisions, to go up in subdivisions, you hit D. To go down in subdivisions, you hit Shift D to go down. Okay? What's that? So if you're looking at, let's say, the geometry panel on the side, the right side, you can use the slider to go up and down subdivisions. It's this little thing here. Or you can hit Shift D and D. What I actually do is, if I've got, depending on which tablet I'm working on, so let's say it's like the Intuos 3, it's got a little touch strip on both sides. One side I use to go up and down subdivisions. The other side, if there's a second strip, I'll use it to undo, redo. Okay, so if you want to add subdivisions, you go to your top subdivision and you hit the divide button. You guys see that? So divide button. And it adds another level of smoothing or division, right? Very good. No? Divide under geometry. You have to be in edit mode for that to work. Okay, so yeah, there is an issue. So this model is basically already pre-subdivided. It's already been kind of set up to start sculpting on. If you go over to the tool panel, right up in the upper right corner, you see there's the polysphere. If you click on the little tool, the large tool icon that's there, it brings up a bunch of other objects. So the objects in the middle, these 3D mesh objects, these are all essentially ZBrush primitives. So they're kind of like Maya primitives, right? When you just create a box, a sphere, a torus, let's say, right? Essentially what you have are preset kind of preset mesh, and this is great for a starting point, but if you try to draw on it, it actually says to enable sculpting, convert this to a 3D primitive to a polymesh 3D. So in order to actually do anything with this mesh, you have to convert it to what's called a polymesh 3D. To do that, you have to go to the upper right corner, make polymesh. I don't know why it's giving me a weird option. I'm like locked now for some reason. Okay. ZBrush being weird. Okay, so the powerful thing though about these primitives is that you can adjust the radius, right? You can kind of like a basic object in Maya. You can change this to give it a break in the ring. You can twist it around itself, which I don't want to do. We can change the number of divisions, so you can go very, very low poly to start. So this is again like a 3D primitive you'd find in Max or Maya, but it's not sculptable yet. Even though we're in edit mode, it's not sculptable until you hit Make Polymesh 3D. Once you hit Make Polymesh 3D, you can sculpt it, you can subdivide it. So again, kind of like that that sphere that we started, that was already converted to a polymesh. It was already subdivided a couple times. We can divide in here, and you see as you divide, right, it starts to smooth out and allow for more detail. So those are basically the 3D primitives. For me, I often just start by going into the tool palette and go right into the polysphere. It just allows me to skip a few steps, especially if you're doing anything kind of organic, let's say. You know, it's nice and easy to just start with this sort of sphere and start working. Sculpting is pretty straightforward. You've basically got brushes. So if you look on the upper left corner ZBrush here, you've got a standard brush. Okay. By default, you've got this huge palette here of brushes that you can grab from. I've kind of grabbed my most commonly used brushes and put them along the bottom. So there's a standard brush. If you want to sculpt in symmetry, by the way, hit X and you'll see 2 red dots. Now, if you don't see them right away, it could be because you're facing maybe a side view. So you're going to have to left click and drag or pen down and drag to rotate to see the front view of your object. Right? So we see the 2 dots, yeah? Everybody see 2 dots? Okay, so we've got a couple of options for sculpting. One is the draw size. This tablet is very weird. I don't know why it's not drawing so well, but okay, hold on. Okay, so yeah, you know, drawing on that surface, sometimes you have to rotate around to find where that middle axis is. Okay. So for me, the standard brush is great. So if you're drawing with the standard brush, again, my brush is being a little weird, my tablet being a little weird. But if you want to adjust strength, you hit U, which is the Z intensity. Or if you go up to the top, you've basically got your options here. There's Z intensity, focal shift, and draw size. Focal shift is kind of like in Photoshop, you know how you've got a softness, hardness setting on a brush, a basic brush. So the higher the focal shift, the finer the focus, and the greater a fall off on the brush you have. So I usually have the focal shift more towards the left side. Draw size is literally the size of the effect of the brush, and then Z intensity is how strong it's pushing in or out. Okay, so right now I've got, it's weird, I don't know what's up with my Cintiq here, but it's like every 4th stroke works, like that one works, and then this one works, and then it goes weirdly thin. I don't know what's up with that, but I'll have to fix that. So you guys can see you can sculpt in symmetry. So a standard brush by default, it actually adds mesh, which if you look at the upper middle portion of ZBrush, you've got Z add, right? You see that, Z add? When you hold Alt, what it's going to do is go to Z subtract. So instead of going back and forth and hitting buttons, you hold Alt, there we go, and you see it's going to gouge into the mesh. And if you want to start blending and smoothing, you hit Shift, and Shift will smooth out the surface and kind of average it out, right? So regular drawing, you just with a standard brush, just regular drawing on the surface by left mouse clicking and dragging, or pen down and dragging, will give you a raised surface. Holding Alt and doing left click drag, pen down drag will gouge in, and Shift, what Shift is actually doing is activating an alternate brush, which is called the smooth brush, right? So it allows you to smooth and average that surface out. Okay. So that's with standard. I use this other brush, which is called the Dam standard, or Damien standard, and you'll see it in the upper left corner at the very bottom of my custom layout. I think you guys have a version of my custom layout on your machines as well, but you'll see Dam standard. Dam standard, what it does is actually creates like gouges in the surface. And again, it's kind of got the same thing. It's got an alternate mode. So if you hold Alt, it'll create a raised surface. So let me undo that. I'm going to subdivide this. So I could go to geometry and divide. The shortcut for adding more polygons or more subdivisions is Control D. So if I hit Control D once, twice, you see the subdivision levels on the right side will go up. And now I get the ability to have finer and finer details. So if I hold Alt here, and I can create a raised, damn this tablet setting, I don't know what's going on with it. It's like the pressure isn't coming through. There we go. So with Alt, it raises, and without Alt, it gouges in. That's the Dynamesh standard. So it's kind of like a gouge brush, or crease brush of sorts. So the other brush that I use a ton, standard brush, Dynamesh standard, move brush. The move brush is fantastic. So I often do this at low resolution. If I'm figuring out proportions, I'm going to use the move brush, drag out my shape, kind of get a feel for it, right? I guess I'm going skeletal here, or mask-like. So the move brush is really powerful at any resolution, but I often use it at low resolution to kind of block out the mesh. And then I can step up in resolution and start to see what's happening with the sculpt, right? By the way, I'm quickly accessing draw size by hitting S on my keyboard. Also, if you're using a tablet pen or mouse, you right-click. I don't know if this thing actually, there we go, right-click, and it actually brings up a compact menu, so you can switch between brushes here very quickly. Or you can adjust draw size, focal shift, Z intensity, which is basically the strength of the brush. You can change all sorts of options here very quickly. So I'm going to just smooth brush this stuff out a bit. Some other brushes, again, clay tubes, clay buildup. Now you might wonder what's the difference between the two. Clay buildup is a very aggressive clay brush. So again, if I can get, there we go. So if I drag across, it's almost like putting strips of clay down on the mesh, which is great. Especially if you come from a traditional sculpting background, you realize this is really good for building up a sense of muscle mass, bone structure, facial structures, any kind of anatomical structures actually. This is really fantastic. Clay tubes, it's kind of a gentler version of clay buildup. Clay buildup is actually much more aggressive. You can see the strokes are kind of thicker and chunkier. Again, my Cintiq is being super weird. I'm gonna have to fix that. But so clay buildup is really just something you would probably use in the early stages where you're building up shapes and forms in the sculpt. Okay. Then of course you can go back and smooth all this stuff out afterwards. Okay, so I'm gonna let you guys play with that. You know, just focus on the basic brushes, move, standard, the two clay brushes. If you want to play with Dynamesh standard too, that's fantastic. All right, so a couple of additional things. So some people ask me, how do you kind of snap this thing so you get a nice kind of clean, almost like front, left, right view? As you're rotating around, so if you kind of left click and drag, as you're sort of rotating the model by just left clicking, dragging, or pen down dragging, you can hold shift and it will snap to a certain view. Right, so you can kind of snap to a top side. Let's rotate around, hold shift, right, so it'll kind of like snap to a view. There's another little extra feature to that. If you hold shift, and kind of like the alt function when you zoom in, zoom out, if you hold shift, start by holding shift and then drag and then let go of shift but keep your pen down or your mouse left click down, you can kind of rotate around as well and then hold shift to kind of snap in that way. So sometimes it's helpful just to get a certain angle on your mesh. Jeez. Okay, so I figured out part of my stroke issue. Oh, maybe I didn't. Did I? Apparently my Wacom is still goofing up here, but okay, so a couple of other features here. I'm going to just smooth this out a bit. So we've got some additional features here. Remember what I said, Shift, Control, Alt. Some combination of those three buttons will give you immense control over the model, okay? Huge amount of functions with those three buttons. So if you're on the model and you hold Control, you can basically paint a mask on that surface by holding Control and drawing on the model, okay? So this can create basically a masking area, which is great because sometimes you might want to do something very specific. Okay, so I'll just kind of quickly try to draw this out despite my tablet issues. Okay, so we've got this mask here. So I could Control tap on this thing to blur the mask. If I Control Alt tap on this, it'll sharpen the edge of the mask. So sometimes if I want to clean up an edge, I'll do that. I'll just kind of blur it and then sharpen it. And what's great about this is that I can now, let's say I go to the move brush. Okay, so I can go move brush and pull this stuff out, which is pretty cool, right? So I get kind of a cool edge to that. And if I want to clear the mask, actually, you know what? If I want to flip the mask, I'll hit Control and tap off the model. That inverts the mask. So Control tap off the model flips the mask around. So I can do some other stuff in here now. So maybe I'll do damn standard, going with a smaller brush size. Again, my Cintiq being a goof. Just Control tap to flip the mask around. So either Control left click very quickly or Control tap the pen. Right? So if your mouse, ideally you should be doing all this with a tablet, but if you're with a mouse, half the time I forget. I just wind up doing stuff with a mouse anyways. But and then if I want to clear the mask, it's Control, click, and drag, which will clear all masking on the mesh. Now you can see my mesh is a little bit distorted, but if I subdivide it maybe once or twice or add a few more divisions, right, I can maybe polish this thing up a bit. Get some cool lines, right? Okay. So, something else very useful. Control Shift together. Control Shift, left click and drag, or mouse down and drag with Control Shift being held, allows you to isolate parts of the mesh. Control Shift tap on what's visible, inverts what's visible. Control Shift tap off the model, unhides everything. Okay. Now that's Control Shift click and drag, right? Again, when you hold down Control, I want you to notice this, by the way. This is something that I may have overlooked in previous lectures, but when you hold Shift down, if you notice in the upper left corner, hopefully you guys can see that. If you look in the upper left corner, you see when I hold Shift, it's activating an alternate brush, which is the smooth brush. If I hold Control down, it activates an alternate masking pen tool. If I hold down Control Shift, it activates this thing called Select Rectangle. Okay? So in each of these, you can control how they're created. So it could be a rectangular shape. I usually do a lasso. So I'm going to switch this to a lasso. This is the Select Rectangle. This is what allows me to shift visibility. So let me just unhide them all for a sec. So I'll try it again. Control, Shift, click, and drag. And you can see I've got a lasso now, so I can go in and isolate a very specific part of the mesh, right? And if I Control tap on that model, it'll invert the selection. If I Control tap off, Control Shift tap off, then it reveals everything, right? So same thing, if I have the masking tool, I find it's okay to brush, but I often like to switch. So while I'm holding Control, sorry, let me zoom in so you can see this. While I'm holding Control, which is the mask pen tool, I'm going to switch from the stroke type to a lasso type. So now when I hold Control to mask, let me just clear this. When I hold Control to mask, I've got this kind of fun lasso that I could play with. So I'm gonna, oh, come on, Cintiq. Right, so now Control, click, and drag to clear that mask. Right, so I can now start doing all sorts of really cool stuff with that, right? So masking, hiding, unhiding, really, really powerful tools. But honestly, for the first week or two, use ZBrush. You can just stick with the standard brush only, the move brush, and it still gives you a ton of options. So undos, I mean, this is very good to know too in any software. Undo is Control Z, allows you to go back. What's great about ZBrush is if you hold Control Z, it'll just jump back through all the steps kind of time lapse, so you can kind of see the progression or regression. Shift Control Z is redo, so you can replay and go forward in the undos. I don't know if you guys noticed at the top of ZBrush, there's these tiny little kind of dark gray cubes. I don't know if you guys see that. This is actually your undo history, and in ZBrush, the current edition, it's quote-unquote unlimited undos and redos. Now keep in mind, if you undo a bunch and then you do something new, it breaks the forward history, right? So if I jump back to the middle here and do something, it's going to break and disconnect what happens after that. It'll start a new, right, series of undos from that point on of what I change. So just be aware of that, but this is really, really useful function, actually. Okay. So that's pretty much ZBrush 101. Masking is just control, click, and drag. Or, yeah, for you, it might still be on default brush stroke. So in this case, you'd be brushing. For me, I switched it to a lasso type. So you can switch between dot, drag, freehand, spray. In this case, I went to lasso. I'll talk a bit more about these maybe in the afternoon section, but so I'm going to mention one other mode. So this is basically just using subdivisions, going up and down subdivisions. I personally like to use, in the early phases of a project, I like to use a different mode. So what I'm going to do, let's say I kind of like where I'm going with this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the lower subdivisions. And if you scroll down, there's a little section. I know ZBrush may seem intimidating, but we're slowly going to get into these menus and submenus. For now, like I said, just stick with the geometry panel and you're going to be fine. But there's this area called Dynamesh. Okay. Dynamesh is different than subdividing, and I don't like to mix the two. If I'm going to Dynamesh, I'm going to stick with Dynamesh and work within that. So what does Dynamesh do? If you guys notice, let me actually undo a bit. Let me go to my lower subdivision. Right, you can sort of see in the lowest subdivision that there's, you know, weird angles and kind of like diamond-shaped polys and stuff, and it kind of leads to weird, right, weird edges. Okay, so the reason I'm gonna go up to my high subdivision and delete this, I'm gonna go delete lower. I'm gonna go back down to Dynamesh. So what Dynamesh does is it kind of puts this imaginary wire cutter, like a square wire cutter, through all from 6 sides, and it basically just gives you even mesh throughout. Very good in the early kind of concept phase for modeling, but it's not something you want to bring into Maya ultimately. So I'm going to just do a really quick demo on this. So if I hit Dynamesh, oops, I got to clear my mask. Okay, so Dynamesh has now been activated. So if you take a look, let me undo redo so you guys can see that. So this is the high subdivision. Okay, and once I Dynameshed, oops. Let me Dynamesh again, I guess. Dynamesh. You see it just kind of like gives you, it does give you some messy polys and stuff, but it creates a consistency throughout the mesh. So if I were to pull out something, so let me go to the move tool. If I were to pull something out, right, you see it kind of gets all stretched out, right? And that becomes a problem. This Dynamesh mode is great because it allows you to kind of, at will, add things, subtract things, not worry too much about the mesh being stretched. So again, this is a little bit confusing, but when you have Dynamesh mode active and you control, click, and drag, it doesn't add a mask or remove it. But when there's no mask on the model and you do a control, click, and drag inside Dynamesh mode, what it does is it redivides stretched out mesh. So you get a nice consistent kind of density in the model. So this allows you to very quickly do kind of like concept sculpting, okay? So this is great, like I said, for anything experimental. Maybe I'll do something really, really drastic so you guys can see this. Maybe I'll pull out like a neck or something here. So even mesh that's kind of like a little messy and overlapped, right? You see it's all skewed and distorted. As long as it's overlapping, you control, click, and drag. It's going to kind of merge it all together into a surface, a more seamless surface. So I'll go in and let's say inflate this. Right, so I can be a little bit kind of reckless in this case and control, click, and drag, and Dynamesh will kind of make this all seamless and smooth, and I can kind of touch up the sculpting a bit. I can re-Dynamesh as I need. And so, like I said, there's this kind of invisible cage that comes through and cuts this. If you want more detail or you don't want to lose detail that you've already added, you can increase the resolution slider, but I would recommend you be very, very careful with this. So it starts at a default resolution of 128. For me, I always look at active points. I don't usually like a Dynamesh model to be higher than 400,000 active points as a general rule. So if I control click and drag this again, you're going to see it goes up to like 700,000 points, right? So it means I can kind of get into finer detail. Now eventually I will need to convert this to a more kind of regular mesh. You guys probably won't get into this for another week or two at least, but let's pretend this is ready to go as a model. What I'm going to do is turn off Dynamesh. Okay. So I'm going to show you this. This would be a typical workflow. So once you get out of the concept phase into a more production-oriented mindset, you're going to go to the subtool palette. Now subtools, basically it allows you to add other mesh. So you can add like little separate details like body armor, costume details, jewelry, stuff like that. And you can organize it. So they're still sort of separate models, but they're still part of one overall project or one tool. So for example, I could say append. In this case, I just have these like default rings. So I'm going to go ring, and it's going to throw in a ring there. And I'm going to just use the move tool actually. I'll select that subtool. There we go. So yeah, let's say I want something like that. Okay, so you know, part of one project, but they're sort of seeing these as separate tools, right? Anyway, so what I'm going to do is once I want to get this Dynamesh model production ready, I usually turn off. It's always a good idea once you're done the kind of Dynamesh phase, turn off Dynamesh. I'm going to duplicate the subtool, so that's right down here in subtool, duplicate. This is some voodoo stuff. I really love this. I'm going to go back to geometry, and so I'm going to go to, let's close that. There's this thing called ZRemesher. So this is where you kind of get out of the mindset of just free sculpting and say, okay, I want to bring this back to Maya. I want to bring this into a game engine or something. I'm just simply going to hit ZRemesher, and it's literally going to go through, analyze the mesh, and essentially create a low poly version for me. You know, I'll get into this the depth of this tool a little bit more in the future lectures, but just to sort of show you the power of this thing, it's unbelievable. So if you take a look, it generated a low poly organized mesh. Okay, the polygons are actually fairly good, and I may even ZRemesh this one or two more times. So I'm going to turn down the target polygon count to like maybe 2,000. This is in thousands, by the way. So when you go target polygon count 2,000, 2 is 2,000. So I'll ZRemesh again. All right, gives me a even lower poly count mesh. And if you take a look, I've got kind of the old and the new version, right? So this is the old version with the crazy high Dynamesh, and this is the newer version. By the way, I often will go to solo mode over here. So solo mode will allow you to just isolate kind of your low, you know, whichever subtool you're working on. So the idea is I want to bring back some of this detail from the other model. Problem is I have a low subdivision mesh now, right? So if I divide this new low subdivision mesh a few times, go back to subtool, there's this amazing option. I'm going to go to project all. So what it's going to do is actually grab the detail from the other mesh and apply it to my new organized model. Okay, so they look now virtually identical. So this is the organized model with a low res subdivision that I can jump up to a high res. All right, I can clean this up now at the higher resolution. It's organized. It's much more efficient. And it's something I can bring back to Maya, basically. So this is kind of your, I would say, your typical workflow in a nutshell, where you start maybe in Dynamesh, do freeform sculpting. You kind of redistribute the polys as you need in Dynamesh. So as things get stretched out and look a bit weird, you control, click, and drag, fix it. Don't get into too much detail. And then when you're ready, you can create a duplicate, ZRemesh it, which gives you organized mesh, and transfer that high poly Dynamesh detail to a subdivided, clean ZRemesh version of that model. So I would now go back to the Dynamesh model and delete that, because I don't need that subtool anymore. I've got what I need from it, and I can now keep working. Like I said, I could go to this mesh and let's see, there's a little option in here. I'm going to reset this to Maya actually. And I can hit Go Z. What Go Z does is a very quick export to Maya. So it'll send the low res mesh into Maya where I can continue to work on it. I could rig it, I could skin it, I could do whatever I want there, right? So we'll see this in a second once it launches.
The subtools are going to appear as separate objects?
It'll be basically like part of one object.
Like, so
There we go.
when you do that, it just transfers the main object. It doesn't bring the subtools with it.
It brings everything. So when you go Z, it'll bring whatever's in that one tool, the subtools and everything, they all come over.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they're separate at the outside.
Yeah. So so this is kind of what I was mentioning. You know, you guys, if you want to like sculpt a gargoyle, do any kind of architectural detail, you can start to play with that in ZBrush. Just make sure that you have a version that maybe isn't so heavy, right? So this thing is what, 5,400 points. Let me go back to Maya here, and yeah, it's 5,420 verts, which is almost the same as faces. Usually those counts are within a few digits of each other, a few numerical points. Now, the other thing is, if I had done UVs on this, I don't have any UVs. Let me go to my lowest subdivision. You could do UVs. I mean, I don't want to get into this too early, but just to kind of do a quick demo, I'll do a quick UV set. So I'm going to go to Z plugin, UV master, unwrap. Done. Now this is a very generic. I'm going to show you what this looks like. Copy UVs, flatten. So this is what the UVs basically look like. It's actually not terrible for this piece, but let me unflatten. I'm going to have to unfreeze. Again, we'll get into this process a bit more in depth. I'm just kind of zipping through it. Let's copy, paste UVs. So what's great about this is that if I go into normal map, go back down, I can create a normal map which actually captures the higher subdivision detail that was there. So all this detail at the higher res, even if I had like fine porous detail, it would actually be captured by a normal map. So if I go Z this back again, I'm not sure if it's going to update with a new, yeah, it should. See if I can render this and get the detail out. Oh yeah, I got to fix something else too. There's bump mapping. Oops. Not sure if it came over actually, but anyways, yeah, once you get some of that detail out, you can basically bring the higher poly sculpting detail in as a normal map or displacement map or bump map basically. So just kind of give you an idea what that looks like. There we go. So any detail that you kind of generate or sculpt at a high subdivision level, I said it's not really usable, but it is in a sense. You can kind of cheat it by bringing in different types of maps that in a sense capture that high poly sculpting detail but apply it to the low res mesh. Let me just go back to Maya. I'm going to create a new scene here. Is it importing? I don't know. Let's try it again. Alright, there we go. I see. I think this is actually by default set up to render in Mental Ray, unfortunately, but yeah, some of the sort of subtle sculpting details are kind of brought through. Now, sometimes you get kind of weird shading, so this is similar to that option I was talking about the other day where you go mesh display, set normal angle. I can set it to 45 degrees. And let's see, that actually looks pretty decent. And yeah, I think if I render, not sure if I'm going to see the maps this time, but Yeah, and it actually applied, if you look this time under normal mapping, it did apply a proper normal map. So, go normal map, and I think that's it. Okay, so that's kind of a compressed intro to ZBrush and workflow between ZBrush Maya.